the extension of the Tang international art style to Japan. I have argued that the kind of Buddhism and Buddhist art associated with Wu Zetian's reign played a very important role in shaping Nara Buddhism and Buddhist art. Now we turn to Heijo-kyo, Nara, and the two monks we will discuss will be Doji and Gendron. Heijo-kyo, or City of Peace, served as the seat of Japan's government for the late Nara period. The city form was modeled after Chang'an, for it was built at a time when Japan wholeheartedly imported Chinese civilization, including the establishment of a Rijulyo state, Rijulyo referring to law and penal codes based on Chinese political theory informed by Confucianism. Compared to Chang'an and Luoyang, Heijo-kyo was the smallest of the three imperial cities. The imperial palace was located in the northern center, while the north-south main avenue was also called the Vermilion Bird Avenue. By the beginning of the 8th century, Buddhism had already been firmly established in Japan with royal patronage, enjoying a more favorable status than that in Tang China. As a result, when the capital was planned, 4 major Buddhist monasteries were slated to be rebuilt in the new capital: Daian-ji, Kofuku-ji, Gango-ji, and Yakushi-ji, or the Medicine Buddha monastery. Doji, who had traveled to China on an official mission from 702 to 718, was assigned to supervise the rebuilding of Daian-ji because of his knowledge on continental practices and was known for various crafts. Scholars probably suggest that he came from a family of Korean immigrants. During this period, immigrants from Korea and China played a very important role in Japan's, at that time, modernization, meaning following continental practices. Among the 3 monks that I talk about today, Doji is probably the least familiar to you. We only have sketchy records about him because there was no tradition of biographical writing in Japan at that time. They didn't even have their own writing system until about a century later. Unlike the extensive records we have about the other 2 Chinese monks. So as a result, I have to confess the chapter on him was the most difficult part to write because of the sources problem. Doji's stay in China overlapped with the last years of the reign of Wu Zetian, her 2 sons, Zongzong and Ruizhong, and also the early years of Emperor Xuanzong. It was a period when Chinese imperial support for Buddhism was at its peak. While in China, Doji must have been steeped in the religious and visual culture of the Tang capitals, in particular the implementation of state Buddhism under Wu Zetian, the flower ornament Buddhism, new deity cults, and also the newly introduced esoteric Buddhism. Because of his presence in China during this important juncture, he became a principal conveyor of the new developments in Chinese Buddhism to Japan, contributing to the internationalizing of Nara Buddhism and Buddhist art. The background to the heightened cultural exchanges between China and Japan during this period was, of course, spurred by Japan's desire to enter into the sphere of Sinic civilization. A similar process occurred during the Meiji Restoration when Japan turned to the West at that time. Before the 7th century, Japan's contact with the continent relied heavily on the Korean kingdoms as intermediaries, with its immigrant communities of Korean and Chinese descent playing a very central role. in the transmission of continental culture to Japan. By the early 7th century, Japan began to send ambassadors to China directly. During the Tang, Japan sent a total of 20 official missions called kentoshi, or embassies dispatched to the Tang. Initially, 1 or 2 ships were sent with about 200 people on board, but by the 8th century, a mission typically consisted of 4 ships, carrying a total of more than 500 people. Each mission was led by an ambassador, 1 or more vice ambassadors, and other officials. Accompanying them were scholars and monks who stayed behind to study Chinese culture or Buddhism for extended periods. There were also sculptors, craftsmen of all trades, painters, and supporting crew. The Kentoshi missions represented Japan's official contact with China and were instrumental in the transfer and circulation of ideas and material culture. Buddhism was seen as an integral part of Chinese civilization that Japan sought to import and emulate, and Doji went to China on one of these official missions. Now, I took this image from a Japanese catalog, which was a reconstruction of one of these ships produced in the Japanese catalog. But one time I gave the presentation to, among the audience was a scholar in the, well, he certainly knew more about me. He later told me this certainly was not a seafaring boat. So it was not a quite right reconstruction. It would have been much more impressive than this. Doji was an important figure in Nara Buddhism. In 729, he was appointed preceptor, the 3rd highest rank in the office of monastic affairs, a position that oversaw the rules regulating the conduct of monks and nuns. It's important because he probably was seen as one of the major figures responsible for the invitation of a Chinese Vinaya, or precepts master, resulting in Gendron's arrival in Japan. In the same year, he was appointed to supervise the rebuilding of Daian-ji. Today's Daian-ji, I mean, it still exists in the southeastern part of Nara, and you can actually visit there. But the scale today is only a tiny fraction of its original size. A reconstruction shows its impressive scale with 2 very large pagodas. Only Todai-ji could have 2 tall pagodas in Nara at that time. We can also note a flower garden in the southeast with its own precinct, probably something he learned when he was in China. What was most notable is that this is the Buddha hall and this is the lecture hall. You see all of these small chambers or cloisters surrounding these 2 central buildings in the central cloister. This is a practice not found in other contemporary Nara monasteries. But in my book, I argue that this indicates Doji as a preceptor. He implemented the design the concept of an ideal monastery, articulated by the Chinese precepts master. Dao Xuan was very well known. He actually was the first abbot of Ximingsi in Chang'an. So this is an indication of Doji implementing something he learned in China back in Japan. By the early 8th century, there were already 3 Buddhist texts that were viewed as having the power to protect the state. The Benevolent King's Sutra, which actually was an apocryphal sutra, meaning composed in East Asia. The Lotus Sutra and the Golden Light Sutra. By the time of Doji, 2 other texts were added to this list, the Great Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, newly translated by Xuanzang, and the Flower Ornament Sutra, retranslated during the time of Wu Zetian. During her time, she also sponsored a retranslation of the Golden Light Sutra. So the choice of these sutras are not an accident, because they were important to state Buddhism both in China and also in Japan. In the 730s, Japan suffered a smallpox epidemic, which killed many people, including many high-ranking ministers at court from the Fujiwara or the aristocratic family. Doji, as a monk official, he called on Buddhism to protect the state. These Buddhist sutras were recited and rituals were performed at court, the first time, and also in the great monasteries, in order to offer prayers for Buddhism to protect the state. The contents of these sutras also inform the general themes of the art of state Buddhism. For example, in the Buddha halls of great monasteries, sculpture groups and murals representing the Buddhist assembly would transform the architectural space into a mythical setting where the Buddha makes his supernatural manifestations for the purpose of teaching. Many Mahayana sutras usually would begin with this setting, the Buddha preaching to the multitudes. So the Buddha hall with the sculpture groups actually is making reference to these sutras. In particular, the Golden Light Sutra. There's an iconographic evidence for that, which I can explain if you're interested. The sculptures in Daian-ji were all made of dry lacquer, very popular technique at that time. The ones at Daian-ji did not survive, but there are a number of sculptures surviving from Kofukuji, which was contemporary. And we can see here a Buddha's disciple, Subhuti, and also Ashura, which is one of the demigods, because among the multitude of beings scattered would include, well, the Buddha himself, his 10 great disciples, the great bodhisattvas, the 4 heavenly kings, and then the 8 classes of beings. So all of these would be represented in the sculpture group. Here we have an example. Now we're looking at a mural from Dunhuang. Again, you see the Buddha surrounded by the bodhisattvas, disciples, and all the large group. Both the Benevolent Kings Sutra and the Golden Light Sutra advocate benevolence and forbearance as qualities of rulership, and that a ruler's patronage of Buddhism will garner the religion's safeguard of the country, especially protection by the 4 heavenly kings. Many monasteries of Nara have statues of the heavenly kings. They wear armor and bear weapons ready to protect the state. In style, they are close to those as far-flung as Dunhuang, which is why I call this a very international visual language. The Golden Light Sutra also introduces a group of benevolent deities who were originally river and earth goddesses of Indian origins. The sutra states that in a country where the sutra is being taught and studied, it will be protected by these goddesses. As a result, we find many images of these goddesses in Nara Buddhist art, a phenomenon not as common in China, and I think this is the divergence that we see between China and Japan. The painted image of Kijijoten, or the goddess of wealth and good fortune, from Yakushiji, or the temple of the medicine Buddha, now portrayed like a Tang aristocratic woman wearing beautiful fabrics, textiles. It became the focus of repentance rituals that included prayers for rain and prosperity for the state. It was a state ritual that began in the mid-8th century. transformed Avalokitesvaras were already introduced to Japan earlier, with many examples from the Nara period. Some were brought there by returning monks, others were created locally. These powerful deities were the focus of state rituals as well. I should point out the one on the left, the nine-headed Guanyin. Actually, the statue is only about this tall. It's made of sandalwood. It was presented to Heijo-kyo, a temple in Nara, around I think 16, in the second decade of the 8th century. And a lot of scholars surmise that this was probably a gift by Doji, the monk that I talk about. He brought this on his return trip from China. It was clearly was made in China, and he presented it to Heijo-kyo after his return. The one on the right, actually, it's among the murals from the famous Heijo-kyo. It also featured the 11-headed Kannon or Guanyin. When Daian-ji was dedicated in 742, Doji and other leaders of the monastery dedicated to the emperor 2 embroidered hangings. They no longer exist. One based on the contents of the Great Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the other based on the Flower Ornament Sutra. Here we have a silk painting and also a mural of the same subject, the 7 locations and 9 assemblies, which is described in the Avatamsaka or Flower Ornament Sutra. The 2 texts, as I mentioned before, had very special meaning in state Buddhism. In summary, the kinds of artworks designed for Daian-ji were all associated with state Buddhism, intended to amplify the religion's protection of the country. Under Doji's leadership, Daian-ji also became a hub for returning monks who had traveled to study in Korea and China, as well as emigrant monks invited to visit Japan. Actually, among them was the Indian monk who came from China to Japan. Later, he would officiate at the eye-opening ceremony for the great Buddha at Todai-ji. The monastery also gained fame as a scholastic and literary center, with many monks claiming lineage to the famous Siming-si in China, in Chang'an. Doji was an important bridge figure that saw the internationalization of Nara Buddhism and Buddhist art. Just about the time of his death, the implementation of a religio-political system in Japan finally came to fruition. But it also meant that Daian-ji was soon overshadowed by something even bigger. When Daian-ji was dedicated in 742, it was considered the most important official Buddhist monastery. However, the year before, Shomu Tenno issued an edict to establish official monasteries and nunneries. They were established throughout the provinces of the country. With the expanded role that Buddhism was to play in Japan's politics, a grander state institution, the Todai-ji, or Great Eastern Monastery, was built at the northeastern edge of the capital. It became the headquarters of this state monastery system, whereas Hokkei-ji would become the headquarters of the state nunnery system. In 743, Shomu also issued an edict to cast a colossal Buddha statue of Vairochana. As in the case of the Vairochana statues that Wu Zetian sponsored, the transcendent Buddha overseeing a centralized hierarchical state church was likened to a Buddhist sovereign overseeing his or her earthly empire. This and other themes discussed earlier were among the most notable contents of this visual language of state Buddhist art in East Asia. In Japan, the great monasteries were not translation centers, but they housed libraries that kept the sutras brought back by returning monks. Later, when the Chinese lost a lot of text, they would send letters to Japan to ask for original copies, to make copies so that the China could have them back again. And there were also scriptoria for copying Buddhist texts, for dissemination and as pious acts. Here we have an example of a Buddhist sutra, the Huayan-jing, copied in the Japanese Imperial Scriptorium, sumptuously produced in silver ink on indigo dyed paper. When we compare the cases of China and Japan, Shomu's declaration of Buddhism as a state religion found precedence in Wu Zetian's reign as a Buddhist monarch. So was the founding of a network of state Buddhist institutions, although Japan also separately had a network of state nunneries. Todai-ji also housed a colossal statue of Vairochana. Despite the fact that Wu Zetian has been more or less treated as an anomaly in Chinese history because she was the only female ruler, she in fact exerted far-reaching impact beyond China's borders. As a female Buddhist sovereign, she additionally provided Komyo, the queen consort of Shomu, who was also a very devout Buddhist, and their daughter, Koken Shotoku, with the model of a female Buddhist ruler. Nevertheless, at Todai-ji, the program of Vairochana further synthesized with the newly introduced esoteric deities, especially the different forms of transformed Avalokitesvara, such as this 8-armed Amogapasha or Avalokitesvara with the never-failing lasso. Like a cowboy, the lasso would never fail to save the people who are descending into hell. Although the esoteric cultic deities first found expression in the art associated with Wu Zetian's court, the iconographic configuration in Japan, especially at Todai-ji, was original and represented a separate trajectory. At the height of Japan's adaptation and transformation of continental forms of Buddhist statecraft and art, the last great pilgrim monk we're going to discuss is Gendron, or Ganjin in Japanese. As recorded in Gendron's biography, the monk failed 5 times to reach Japan before succeeding finally with his 6th journey. Gendron was a native of Yangzhou. After training in the town capital, he returned to practice at Damingsi of Yangzhou. Here in this later pictorial biography, it shows that in 742, 2 Japanese monks who had come to China earlier on an official mission, they came to invite Gendron to visit Japan. By that time, Gendron was already famous as a master in Buddhist precepts. The master agreed and preparation for the trip began. Unfortunately, the first 5 journeys were unsuccessful because of one reason or another, including shipwrecks due to strong winds, as shown in this dramatization of the 13th century pictorial biography called the Toseiden Emaki. The most dramatic was the 5th trip, when the currents took the boats all the way to Hainan Island. So, along the way, they encountered many difficulties. The biography also records extraordinary happenings, including 4 large fish. According to some interpretation, these were the avatars of the 4 heavenly kings who protected them, guiding the boat to shore. And then miraculously, there was a pond with drinking water, and you can see the monks drinking from the pond. In the biography, there are very detailed lists of the objects prepared for the journeys. The second, fifth, and sixth were particularly in great details, although only the last journey was carried out successfully. It also records that for the second trip, accompanying Gendron were 85 artisans, including jade workers, painters, sculptors of wooden Buddha images, wood and metal engravers, artisans who could cast statues and ritual implements, embroiderers, scribes, and stonemasons. This didn't occur. For Gendron's last and successful journey, because he returned with the official mission that the Japanese invited him to join, so he could only take a smaller group. Nevertheless, there were 24 disciples and followers who went with him. Some of them were very skilled craftsmen, including Central Asian and Southeast Asians. Such detailed records demonstrate the mechanisms for the transfer of knowledge, religious doctrine and practices, material culture, technical skills, and art styles. Now, let's focus just on the list he actually brought to Japan and what it recorded. An embroidered painting of the Universal Assembly of all deities, a painting of Buddha Amitabha, the Lord of Western Pure Land, a statue of the 1,000-armed Guanyin in white sandalwood, an embroidered image of the same deity, the Guanyin who relieved the sufferings of sentient beings, by Sajaguru, a medicine Buddha, Amitabha, and Maitreya Bodhisattva. Okay. So among these icons, medicine Buddha, Maitreya, Amitabha have been popular icons for devotion since the 6th century. The embroidered painting of Pujibian, or Universal Assembly of All Deities, suggests that this probably was a mandala, a magical diagram or cosmic space occupied by a host of Buddhist deities arranged in a concentric arrangement, like the one on the screen. By the time of Gendron's travel, esoteric Buddhism was prominent at the Tang court, and it would not be a surprise to learn of Gendron bringing a mandala to Japan. Although we generally think of the mandala being introduced to Japan in the 9th century by Kukai, we also didn't know, even though a mandala was brought to Japan, we don't know whether people actually knew how to use it and so on. The list included several Guanyin images, and you see how important that was. One of them was Juku Guanyin, or Avalokitesvara, in the role of a savior who relieves the sufferings of sentient beings. We also have images of the Juku Guanyin at Longmen and Dunhuang, actually with the inscribed name. So here's an example from Dunhuang. The other two are the 1,000-armed Guanyin. We talked about how 11-headed or Amugapasha had been introduced to Japan earlier. We think the first instance of an image of the 1,000-armed Guanyin was brought to Japan by Gendron, even though the text might have been introduced to Japan a little bit earlier. In fact, both in China and Japan, when the 1,000-armed Guanyin was introduced, because it was so powerful, it has 1,000 arms, so it superseded all the other early forms. It became the most important one, the most powerful one. The Bodhisattva was worshipped for the healing and protecting power, both for the individual and for the state. We actually read that many monks worship Guanyin. Xuanzang did, and Gendron and Doji most likely also did as well, because Guanyin also protect travelers, protect them for the safety from robbery and so on. Gendron also brought the Buddhist relics, encased in a greenish glass bottle. These are the original relics he brought, and are still the focus of veneration in the temple that he founded. The gilt bronze container was actually added a bit later. There were a total of 48 titles of Buddhist texts, with many of them written in gold letters. In addition, the list mentioned items that were intended as gifts to the Japanese court. There were banners in crystals and jade rings, glass bottles from a Western country, most likely Sasanian glass, 20 stamps of blue lotus, dish in tortoise shell, and Indian leather boots. There were also works of calligraphy by the 4th century master Wang Xizhi and his son Wang Shizhi. The calligraphies of Wang Xizhi were especially admired for the elegance and spontaneity both in China and Japan. One of the few extant works is the Sangluantie, a letter to express worry and indignation at the destruction of ancestral temples. It is now in the imperial collection in Japan and is believed to have been one of Gendron's gifts to the Japanese court. However, scholars nowadays generally agree that this was a Tang copy and not an original Wang Xizhi's work. Soon after the Japanese Shomu Tenno's death in 756, Komyo, dedicates consort, dedicated some 600 artifacts from the emperor's collection to the great Buddha at Todai-ji. They were housed in the famous Shoshoin on the grounds of Todai-ji, now considered the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, because this imperial treasure house includes many artifacts of international character collected by Shomu. Therefore, Gendron's legacy and relevance as an agent of artistic transmission extended far beyond the Buddhist domain. Now I come to the last segment, so we'll finish maybe in about 5 to 10 minutes. Upon arrival in Kyushu, in southern Japan in late 73, Gendron and his group, in the early months of 754, they traveled north and arrived at Nara, where they were housed at Todai-ji. Immediately, the master began to advise on matters concerning ordination practice. That was the purpose of his traveling to Japan. Actually, there was an interesting story about his invitation. The Japanese official first went to the emperor to ask for permission to invite Gendron. Xuanzong actually told the monks and said, well, why don't you bring with them Taoist priests to spread Taoism in Japan? The Japanese monk demurred, and so they secretly actually smuggled Gendron out. They were not interested in the spreading of Taoism in Japan. So immediately, he built a temporary ordination platform in front of the Great Buddha Hall. And the master performed ordination for Shomu, who was now the retired Tenno, the reigning ruler, Koken, Komyo, his consort, and also some 440 clerics, kind of reordinated in the proper way. Here we have an image of the current Great Buddha Hall rebuilt in the 17th century in a ceremony. The rebuilding actually was smaller than this original size. At that time, the largest wooden structure in the world. In 1755, a permanent ordination platform was built at the suggestion of Gendron to the west of the Buddha Hall. In 758, the court gave Gendron about 100 hectares of land so that he could build his own monastery. This became the Daian-ji, a center for precept studies with Gendron as its abbot. Here we have a ground plan with the usual main buildings, this Miedo in the north actually consists of his portrait sculpture that we just looked at. And the ordination hall with the platform would be located to the west. Here we have the picture of the main hall. If we look at the elevation, the reconstruction, the top one actually shows the Tang model. The appearance is certainly a little less ponderous than what it looks like today. The long lecture hall originally was a building from the Heijo Palace. It was given to the monastery when the latter was under renovation. So from the architectural perspective, this is actually quite interesting. The current ordination platform was built in the 17th century because there had been fires, war, and a lot of destruction throughout the centuries. The building housing the platform was lost in a fire and was not rebuilt. So here we have the stone platform in 3 levels. This little stupa shape is actually modern, after the Great Sanchi Stupa in India, added in about 1980. The stupa structure symbolizes the presence of the Buddha, who would lend authenticity to the ordination ritual performed on the platform, and thereby giving legitimacy to the Buddhist Sangha or monastic community. In the spring of 763, one of Gendron's disciples had a dream. In that dream, the balcony of the lecture hall had collapsed, and he took this as a premonition of his master's imminent death. A portrait of Gendron was made in dry lacquer, hollow dry lacquer, executed by one of his disciples and another Japanese artisan. With eyes closed, the sculpture not only captures the likeness of the master, but imparts to the viewer his inner spiritual strength and determination. This is the first real-life portrait of East Asia. The 3 statues in the main hall actually, let's take a look at this. Vairochana Buddha in the center, the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara to the left, and Medicine Buddha to the right. All of these were probably completed after Gendron's death, and they were carried out by his followers, and the heavier figure style actually was already a departure from what we call the Haitang style, and was a harbinger for the later Heian sculpture. But this configuration was really quite interesting. Vairochana, of course, references the Vairochana Buddha in the Todai-ji, which was the focus of flower ornament Buddhism. He brought 2 1,000-armed Guanyin to Japan, so this is actually a commemoration of his own devotional faith. Of all the statues of this deity, this is probably one of the very few that literally had 1,000 arms. Okay, so a few had lost, but it was intended to have totally 1,000 arms. And then the Medicine Buddha. Now, Gendron himself was also an expert in medicine. In fact, when he was in Japan, the imperial court asked him to identify medicine collected in the imperial pharmacopoeia. So he was supposed to smell the different medicine and then tell the Japanese what they were for. So now, Gendron, he arrived in Japan at the peak of Tang civilization, right in the middle of the 8th century, with his cultural brilliance and material prosperity. But he was also the last great 8th century figure to convey the cosmopolitan Buddhist ideals, art forms, and practices to Japan. Because back in China, the outbreak of the Anlushan rebellion from 755 to 63, the year he died, brought an abrupt end to this glorious page of Tang history. Today, Damingsi in Yangzhou honors Gendron with the building of the main hall in Tang architectural style. Actually, it was advised by the famous Chinese architectural historian Liang Xichen, who proposed this reconstruction to commemorate the important role the monastery and Gendron played in East Asian cultural history. Gendron's activities illuminate the role of agents like him in the transmission and circulation of ideas and material culture. In many sense, this was a collective enterprise and not just the result of a handful of individuals. Along with the propagation of an ideal Buddhist state, the transmission and circulation of Buddhism, its doctrines, and its performative practices and art styles across borders created a shared common identity across China and Japan, and to some extent, Korea. Transcending geographical and political boundaries, this shared religious ideal and its visual language therefore became international, global, and cosmopolitan. Thank you.